Let's go ahead and talk about what's happening in Arkansas and Missouri.
And not just the Mississippi Flyway, you know, things are going on and change of the land and climate and hunting in the Central Flyway. Gosh, the Atlantic Flyway has seen tremendous declines in habitat on the coast, just like Larry talked about for Louisiana. And change is inevitable, and we, as Larry talked about, have this kind of proclivity to want things to be the same all the time. And someone said recently that the status quo that we kind of want or live in right now, from a management standpoint, is really not acceptable. That we need to be adaptable and we need to understand change, and we can't just pretend that it was the same as it was 20 years ago. You know, Jim may have had a wonderful hunt 20 years ago and patch of bottomland hardwoods that now is either no longer there or has changed, is not the same. Dave may have had a wonderful hunt in southeastern Alberta that used to be grassland and prairie potholes and now is not there. You all here at Grosse Savanne used to have wonderful hunting in a spot that now is open water and changed chemistry-wise and so forth. So that's the real world. The mid-continent area then has been a subject of a lot of discussion, probably a lot of misinformation recently. Both the short-term and the long-term are factors that relate to climate, to landscape change, and then probably us as people and as hunters. So let me focus just kind of on the landscape changes, and then Kason will get into some details about specific agricultural things. So like Larry and you all talked about, Doug, I want to talk about wetland change in the mid-continent, and water change, and river change. I want to talk about agricultural change that's occurred in the mid-continent, and I want to talk about use of the land. First off, similar in many ways to the loss of coastal habitat in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, you name it, the river systems that were really kind of the interstates that birds moved up and down the mid-continent have been impacted tremendously. I think most folks know that now there's either reservoirs on a lot of our river systems, lock and dams, floodplain constrictions, levees have been built, cities have expanded. Look at the flooding in 2019. We know we had a heck of a lot of rainfall this year, but the flooding has been made worse because of levees and roads and ditches and reservoirs and tile drainage and all of the things that have happened. So that having been said, the wetland loss in the mid-continent, bad enough in Louisiana, is even worse in the Midwest. A lot of the figures show that states like Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, to some degree, Iowa and Nebraska, we've lost like 80 to 90% already of the historic wetlands we've had. Thank goodness Arkansas has still quite a bit of habitat. Louisiana has quite a bit, albeit degraded. So that's a negative, obviously, in the world that we live in and we try and manage, that we've lost a lot of that wetland, historic, especially floodplain habitat, and it's altered. Now, having said that, there's also some positive things. One of the real kind of great things that happened in the early 1980s with the establishment of the Farm Bill that established CRP, that I think by now is a pretty common term for duck hunters, that we know the value of that in the north, but it's also not only the north, but also in the Midwest and even in the South. We now have WRP. They used to be called WRP, now WRE, which is a wetland reserve program. We've got some really interesting figures on that, and I'll use Missouri because that's my home. By the way, I'm an old farm kid from northeastern Missouri. I grew up on a small farm in the farming community in northeastern Missouri, so I grew up driving the tractor and playing in the mud with my dad on the bulldozer and all that. And so now in my 60 plus years of life, I've seen a lot of these changes. But the cool thing with that farm bill in the early 1980s and establishing this program, that in the state of Missouri now, we have actually almost an increase of 200,000 acres of wetlands in the state of Missouri since the early 1980s. So it's not all negative. So this landscape that we tend to talk about the negatives, there's also some positives. There's some changes that have led to different conditions. These birds are responding to those changes. Just like we would respond, and I got to use this analogy. If we went to a restaurant, it was a really good restaurant, let's say it was a buffet sort of thing, and we went in and it was a wonderful buffet and it was great and all that sort of stuff, and we said, man, we're telling our buddies, and we go there the next time, well, what happens if they never put out any more food? The second time you go, and so maybe part of the steak's gone and the prime rib's gone, but there's still food, so it's kind of okay. Well, anyway, we go back then the third time, and they still haven't put out any new food, and so now all the good stuff is gone, and it's like, man, I'm not going back there anymore. The ducks are no different, you know, so they're sampling. They're sampling the landscape, and they're making adjustments and changes within a year, from year to year, and some of the stuff Paul will talk about with telemetry. It's amazing, as you talked about, how these birds are sampling, they're reacting, and they're changing where they go in relationship to security in terms of refuges, isolation, freedom from disturbance, food, a big one, cover, social status requirement, things like pairing habitat and all that sort of stuff. So they're reacting to that. So on the positive, this wetland habitat, like in Missouri, with an increase of about 200,000 acres of that, it's not all high quality, but it beats the heck out of a cotton field, believe me that. So that's a real positive. Missouri's not alone. If you look up and down the Mississippi Flyway, big increases in wetland areas in some places along the river systems, and at the same time degradation. So I just wanted to throw that in. There's been some real cool things. The other thing with the advent of certain conservation programs, including the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, state programs in states like Arkansas and Missouri that have now dedicated sales tax, portion of sales tax that go to wetland restoration programs and so forth. We've been able to add wetland habitat, develop it, take marginal agricultural land, put it back into wetland habitat, now manage it intensively, have public hunting opportunity, also have refuges that are key for this long-term success of birds. So for example, in Missouri, after what we call the Design for Conservation, in the 1970s, when the sales tax, 1/8 to 1% sales tax was passed, Missouri now has basically quadrupled the number of public wetland areas in the state. They're very intensively managed for bottomland hardwoods where it exists, moist soil habitat. There's rotation of some agriculture to promote the natural vegetation and also to provide food for birds. It's no longer going to be just sufficient to rely on Mother Nature for it to rain and flood to support ducks. So these managed habitats are critical. Some people don't like those managed habitats. They say, well, all the birds get concentrated on them and they don't spread out. Believe me, the places, and we know this from hardcore data, the places in the United States that have the best hunt are also the places that are near good wetland habitat, public habitat, and refuges. You want to kill more ducks, you got to have more ducks. To have more ducks, you got to take care of them. To take care of them, you got to provide food and cover and refuge and habitat, freedom from disturbance. It's not a real complicated equation. And I think in many cases we're doing a better job of that. In other cases we're probably not. So when we ask the question about why the duck is here maybe this year or not here this year, we need to first take a mirror and look at ourselves, our own place, our own backyard, and say, is that buffet that no longer has all that food? Well, it's no wonder the ducks aren't there anymore, just like you talked about in Louisiana. Let's be pretty careful about pointing that finger at somebody else, because lots of times that finger needs to be turned around and pointed directly back at the habitat and the conditions and the management that we have. So with that, let's talk about agriculture a little bit. This has been a hot topic. It's been a topic of a lot of misinformation about what's going on. Let's talk about corn first. Everybody wants to blame something, and a lot of people have pointed that finger directly at corn. I think a misplaced pointed finger at corn. Agricultural crops are part of the reason that we have as many waterfowl as we do in North America. Just look what happened after the turn of the century with like the Grand Prairie in Arkansas, or with the increase of crop production in the floodplains of the Midwest, or the rice productions down on the coast. Honest truth, with the loss of wetland habitat, had we not had all of that agriculture, we wouldn't be sitting here fussing about whether we've got 6 ducks in 60 days. We'd be probably talking about 20 days and 2. So before you start blaming agriculture, you better back up and think about the positive aspects of that agricultural base on the landscape nationwide. Remember, I'm a farm kid from Missouri, so I'm going to defend that a little bit. But with that agricultural base, it's also been incorporated into our waterfowl management scenarios for geese, for ducks, for shorebirds, for a lot of other sort of critters. It's not all just about how much corn is there or how much rice is there, but also the rotation of the various commodity crops and the various aspects of it. Let's look at corn for just a minute. It is true, it is very true, that the acreage of corn planted in the major flyway corridors, especially in Mississippi and the Central Flyway, in the mid-latitude and especially in the north, has increased. Use a couple of figures. Since 1990, the corn acreage in North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. This is not Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana Corn Belt stuff. This was stuff north of that. That corn acreage has increased by 12.5 million acres since 1990. That's a lot. It's coupled in part with climate. We now have genetic varieties, earlier maturation, shorter stature, higher yield varieties, more fertilizer opportunities and chemical options and so forth. With climate change, we can grow an increasing amount of corn in the north compared to what we had. I'll use acreage for just North and South Dakota as an example. From 1955 to 2018, we had a 102% increase in corn since 1990, with a net gain of 4.5 million acres of corn in North and South Dakota alone. A lot of folks want to just blame, like Missouri, or blame Illinois, or blame Iowa as far as this business of having more corn. Well, I won't be surprised, Dave, that at some point we don't see more corn production in southern Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. That's part of the world of commodity production, and it's part of the world of climate change. It's also what we're not going to be able to stop, nor should we. But we need to understand those changes that have occurred. So leave it to say, yes, there is a lot more corn in the upper Midwest. Does that mean that all of that corn is feeding a duck? No, because a lot of that corn now is of a shorter maturation window. For example, in Missouri, where I live in southeastern Missouri, most of our corn is harvested by September, and shortly thereafter, they're either tilling those cornfields up, or even if the waste grain, as Larry talked about, less waste grain in rice, there's less waste grain left in corn. All our good combines and all of the varieties we have now and so forth, not much corn left. And what is, it's September, it's warm, the corn waste grain falls to the ground, and it germinates. And so you'll go out in a cornfield in southeast Missouri in late September, early October, it looks like it's been planted because the corn waste grain fell on the ground, it was moist, it sprouted, and so all of a sudden it looks like a planted cornfield. Is any of that waste grain going to feed a duck? No, none of it. So just to blame it all on corn acreage is misplaced and mistaken. It's not to say that there aren't places where a lot of that does feed ducks, because it certainly does.
You talked about economic drivers with our rice and crawfish. What's the economic driver? Why is there so much more corn in those regions?
Yeah, the increase in corn has a lot obviously to do with economics in the commodity world, and a lot of it had to do with ethanol production. When we started blending gasoline in an ethanol manner and the increased use of that really exploded. The other thing was it gave farmers some more options, again with climate change and so forth, that they could do more rotational cropping, where perhaps in the past, like in North and South Dakota, they might not have had a window of time to plant corn or whatever. This gives them another option, rotation with wheat or with soybeans in some places and so forth. So it's driven by economics again quite a bit.
So you mentioned Missouri and those places getting the blame for a lot of stuff. It's no secret, we all know that hunting clubs are now planting corn, flooding corn for their purposes of harvesting ducks. But do we know, do we have a quantification of how many acres, we're talking about agriculture acres here, can we quantify how many acres are actually being used for recreational purposes? And if so, is that having an impact? Is that enough acreage on short-stopping ducks? I mean, that's the million-dollar question here.
Yeah, and that's good, excellent question. One of the things we'll probably discuss as the day goes on are uncertainties, things that we have less information on. And yet in our modern world, when the eye in the sky can look down and determine, the variety of tires we got on our truck, we ought to be able to have technology, and we do, to be able to use satellite imagery and so forth to determine essentially how many acres of whatever, rice, corn, millet, smartweed, you name it, with the signatures of the images to determine what's out there. Some marvelous things have been done in the waterfowl world, like the Lower Miss joint venture in other places of quantifying how much flooded habitat from flooding occurs annually, what's flooded, when, where, and all that. So we're in the process of trying to gather that. We don't have a complete number yet. I can't give you a number of that. I will say it's very true that a lot of duck hunting clubs or waterfowl hunting clubs that do use crops of some sort, not just corn. Milo, obviously they're incorporating in some cases other crops in their management. We use it lots of times in a rotation with our moist soil because we need to disturb the moist soil about once every 3 years, and we'll use it cropping, so we're stripping. So one year it'll be in moist soil. Next year we may do a fall Japanese millet planting, and the third year we may do a corn crop, and then we'll reverse it, and the next year goes back to moist soil. A lot of national wildlife refuges, state areas use the same thing. So the planting of corn or rice or milo or millet or whatever you want to talk about on our wetland areas is not just to kill ducks, but also provides an important nutritional value to those birds, especially in midwinter when they're seeking high energy resources, pair formations going on, it's getting colder. So it does provide a really important resource for the birds. It's not just about killing the duck. It's about providing the habitat. This has been an accepted practice, again, dating back to the 1920s. You can look at the literature. Frank Grelros has written about it extensively. It's been discussed and talked about from California to South Carolina. South Carolina one time had a huge amount of rice production and so forth. So, it's part of the equation. In my mind, it's a very acceptable part of the equation. There are baiting laws, obviously, that restrict the manipulation of that and spraying. You can't just go take a truck out and dump corn. I know some people think there's big helicopters flying over Missouri dumping corn. Folks, that's stupid. I mean, get away from that. Let's be real. I mean, that doesn't happen. Yeah, we use agriculture in our wetland management and for our waterfowl purposes, and it serves multiple purposes. In my mind, are very acceptable and a good tool.
We know there's a movement to address that issue of flooding corn, but if I understood you right, we really don't know how much of that's even occurring. We don't know if that's having a total effect. We're making a lot of assumptions,
That's
but
right.
we don't know right now. The answer is we don't know.
We don't have the very specific numbers. Let me throw an interesting number out at you though. Some folks would like to think that there are a lot more flooded corn acres on some of our national wildlife refuges and state areas and all that. And in 2018 and 19, if anything went down, didn't go up. All you've got to do is look at a lot of the national wildlife refuges. Most of the refuges anymore do not plant agricultural crops, or especially corn, on them because of various reasons and all that sort of stuff. So if anything, a lot of those areas have less of that than they did 10 years or 15 years ago or so forth. It will be important as we go forward to quantify, have the specifics, understand, and have the real data and the biology determine what real impacts, and a lot of things we can do with telemetry, with other studies to advance that understanding. But I think at this point it is very insincere to point fingers at that and claim that that's a problem.
But, and Larry and I talked about this a little bit last week, there is some talk about trying to identify that. I think you
Yes, there
alluded
is.
to that.
Yeah.
We think that technology that we can go back on aerial imagery and actually look and see if there's a pattern, if that's really having an effect flyway wide.
That's right, with satellite telemetry and satellite imagery and so forth. I think that's right. Let me quickly.
Well, and I would like to interject one piece of information relative to what Mickey said. Heath Hagee is the head of the research committee at the Mississippi Flyway Council Technical Committee, and I asked him. Obviously, I have received a brunt of that kind of criticism about flooded, unharvested corn up the Flyway. And the only place where I've been able to generate any solid numbers came from Heath Heggie. He's in charge of the National Wildlife Refuges in the southeastern United States. And he informed me that primarily due to GMO restrictions from the federal government, the amount of cooperatively farmed, flooded, unharvested grain on the National Wildlife Refuges dropped from 104,000 to below 40,000 in the last 7 or 8 years. So at least on southeastern National Wildlife Refuges, the amount of flooded, unharvested grain has declined markedly recently. But there is no information from private lands. And some of our partners on the Mississippi Flyway have committed to trying to develop the GIS technology, or use, obviously, if we could use declassified technology, as Mickey described, we could probably make a lot more progress more quickly. But some of our partners with GIS skills are committed to attempting to get those signatures sorted out so that we can get some quantitative information on that one particular habitat type that's receiving a bunch of criticism. But I'm all on board with Mickey saying it's just one aspect of the ecology of migrating birds. And of course, a lot of the ducks that we kill here in Louisiana aren't very interested in corn.
And it's cool, the telemetry studies that have been done, and we'll get into talking about that later. It's very true that at certain times of the year when maybe it's colder, they're in high energy demand periods, we'll seek out those high energy foods. And corn, rice, milo, etc., many places have replaced the natural foods that have been lost, like acorns in the bottom and hardwoods that we don't have much of anymore. So, they're going to that. But the telemetry studies are cool because it's also showing that the birds may go there at certain times, but they don't go to a cornfield and stay in a cornfield. They're going there for specific reasons, specific times, and all of that. Let me switch to rice a little bit.
That was my next question.
Because it's not just corn. Everybody wants to talk about corn. Rice, again, partly with climate change and new varieties and so forth, has been marching north, believe it or not. We're growing rice in southern Illinois. The figures from southeastern Missouri are real interesting. In 1977, I think it was, we grew about 8,000 acres of rice in southeastern Missouri. In 2018, we harvested almost 250,000 acres of rice. So you talked about now only having, how many 100,000 acres of rice that's not crawdad fields in Louisiana? And so you got now down to 100, and we think, gosh, rice production in Louisiana is a big deal. We don't think about southeastern Missouri, and yet we've got 2.5 times now as much rice in southeastern Missouri compared to what we had in the 1970s. Now, it's not all the best habitat for reasons that Casey will talk about, but wow, isn't that interesting? Southern Illinois is growing a lot of rice. One of the very first varieties of rice in Missouri was actually grown all the way up near Quincy, a variety called Palmyra. It's not grown up there anymore. So the land is changing, the point being. Agricultural land is changing, and believe me right now, in 2019, this is going to be one of the greatest natural experiments we've ever had. If somebody wanted to hang their hat that Louisiana in particular is going to have millions of mallards show up next year because there's no corn in the upper Midwest, let's look what happens in 2019 and 20. The floods in the upper Midwest, you all seen it from Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas River Valley. We've had a tremendous amount of flooding. I've heard some statistics, I don't know if they're exactly right or not, but there will probably be less than 50% of the historic corn acreage planted in a lot of the floodplains in the upper Midwest areas that waterfowl really frequent because of flooding issues. I'm a farmer still. We've gone to prevent planting. We have not even planted a lot of ours this year because we missed our crop insurance deadlines. It's getting too late. Part of my land is actually still flooded right now. When I go home tomorrow, I'm going to be fighting beavers and pulling water trying to drain ag fields so we can plant soybeans. But there's going to be a heck of a lot less corn planted this year than maybe the last 40, 50 years. So that's going to be an interesting natural experiment. So stay tuned, folks, and we'll see if in fact your hypothesis is correct.